If supported by the member states, I would be deeply honored to serve once more.
Thank you, Moon.
Virtually assured of securing a second 5-year term as UN chief, Ban Ki-moon formally announces his candidacy for the post. With no competition and almost guaranteed a consecutive term, this time around would Ban Ki-moon be able to fend off criticism that he's not been outspoken enough and stand up to the powers that back him? The UN Secretary General, can there ever be a perfect one? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. It's good to have you with us. I'm Divya Gopalan. Now, on Monday, Ban Ki-moon formally announced his candidacy for a second 5-year term as UN Secretary General. Ban took the job in 2007, and his term is due to expire at the end of the year. Now, from the beginning, Ban has presented himself as a man of quiet diplomacy. However, he's been criticized for being too deferential to the powerful nations which control the Security Council, and also for being too timid to confront the world's worst human rights abusers. But with no rival for the post, the former South Korean foreign minister is almost certain to be re-elected. From New York, Kath Turner reports.
After almost 5 years as one of the top officials at the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon wants 5 more.
This morning, I sent a letter to the membership of the General Assembly and the Security Council, offering humbly myself for consideration for a second term as a Secretary General of the United Nations.
The announcement comes as no surprise, and Ban is widely expected to be re-elected unopposed. His first term got off to a dramatic start in Baghdad. Since then, it's been relatively drama-free, in line with his low-key personality and quiet diplomacy style. The Secretary-General has made his priorities clear. He's been a vocal advocate for democracy and human rights. Immediately after the election in Côte d'Ivoire, Ban repeatedly called on Laurent Gbagbo to step aside. He also declared his support for protesters during the various uprisings across the Arab world.
This is once-in-a-generation opportunity to advance freedom and democracy.
The Secretary-General has taken on climate change as his pet cause, with mixed results. While he's been given credit for bringing attention to the issue, various global warming summits have failed to produce any consensus or binding agreements from world leaders. Ban Ki-moon says during his first term he's tried to be a bridge builder and says the world is increasingly looking to the United Nations for leadership during a time of unprecedented global change. But there are concerns that Ban's softly approach is stopping the United Nations from delivering on its promises. Philippe Bolapion from Human Rights Watch says Ban's failure to condemn some countries is inexcusable, especially China.
We really hope that once his re-election is secured, he will be able to speak out about the situation there, because he has often been seen as someone who was reluctant to stand up to permanent members of the Security Council.
The Chinese ambassador to the UN has come out in favour of a second term for Ban.
He's a person that has demonstrated strong leadership, and is a person of action, and is a person with a vision for a better world and better UN.
But critics say Ban Ki-moon has little to show for his first term. He'll most likely have another 5 years to try to prove them wrong. Kath Turner, Al Jazeera at the United Nations, New York.
Well, joining us now are our 3 guests. In Washington, D.C., Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, a former U.S. representative for special political affairs at the U.S. missions to the United Nations. Then in London, we have Jeremy Corbyn. He's a member of British Parliament with the Labour Party. And in Islamabad, IMRAN Khan, a chairman of the political party Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. That's the Pakistan Movement for Justice. Welcome you all to the programme. Now, I'd like to start with Nancy Soderberg first. Nancy, if you could tell us what you think will be different this time if Ban Ki-moon gets the position again as UN Secretary General.
Well, first of all, I think he will get it. He doesn't have any opposition. He's got the permanent 5 members of the Security Council lined up, so that pretty much assures his re-election. And I think you won't see a dramatic change. This is not a bold newsbreaker. He's someone who works quietly behind the scenes. I think you'll see him be a little bit more outspoken in some areas, but he reports to the Security Council, owes his post to the Security Council, and will continue to be responsive to their constraints on him.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn, as Nancy Soderberg said, Ban Ki-moon is not a bold newsmaker, and he's one for quiet diplomacy. Is that the type of person we need at these times when you look at what's happening in the Middle East and most of the world, where we're seeing what you call unprecedented change?
I think Nancy's right. He probably will be reappointed for another 5-year term. Whether he's the right person or not is a completely different question. I think we need somebody that's bold. We need somebody that's assertive of the values and interests of the United Nations. And under Ban Ki-moon, he has not been particularly successful either in a political settlement in Libya, Afghanistan, or indeed Iraq. And above all, he has allowed, or indeed perhaps encouraged, NATO to become effectively a military arm of the United Nations. And I think we need somebody far tougher, far stronger, who's going to make the world understand that we've got to bring about peace, and we've also got to bring about a greater degree of social justice around the planet.
And Imran Khan, how do you think Ban Ki-moon has represented developing countries, for instance, Pakistan, which has been turmoil in recent years? Has he been strong enough or put a case strong enough to help Pakistan?
I don't expect any change. United Nations came into existence because the weak needed to be protected from the strong. But unfortunately, the UN has maintained the status quo. In other words, whatever the permanent members want, it happens. And Pakistan, is the only country, I think, in history which is being bombed by its own ally. Through drone attacks, we had just 20 people killed yesterday, violating our sovereignty. And our government protests, whether it is genuine or not, the protest, that's debatable. But the government protests and yet nothing happens. So, I don't expect anything different. I think UN will remain basically subservient to the powerful nations. And the weak nations will not be protected. Their interests will not be protected. And the lives, the human rights will not be protected.
Nancy Soderberg, you were former U.S. representative for special political affairs at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. So I want you to respond to what Imran Khan just said, saying that the U.S. maintains the status quo. Is that the issue at hand? Is that why the UN can't work, or UN Secretary Generals cannot work independently? Is there a shadow of the U.S.?
Well, I think there's a misunderstanding of what the UN can do and what it can't do. The UN is a function of the 192 member states that pay their bills, write the rules, give its instructions. So the Secretary General and his staff can only do what the member states want them to do, and you don't have agreement on a lot of this issue. The earlier comment about having the Secretary General stand up to NATO in Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan is not realistic. The member states want NATO in there. They have veto power to stop it. Usually there's a division among the P5, China and Russia side on one side, the European and the U.S. on the other. But on this instance, they did get the acquiescence to go into Libya, and I think they're there to protect the people. I'm not sure what more we ought to be doing there. We are protecting the citizens from the thug Gaddafi. If you look at what the legacy of the first term of Ban Ki-moon is, first of all, you have to remember the scenario under which he was selected. The Bush administration opposed Kofi Annan's activism. They wanted someone who was going to be more of a manager, and that's what they got in Ban Ki-moon. He's, I think, done a terrific job quietly behind the scenes in resolving the crisis in the Ivory Coast. That's a slaughter that's been prevented, working with us in the handoff to the UN in Iraq. They are working with us side by side in Afghanistan. They will eventually end up with Libya once the bombing campaign stops. They're powerless to do much when the U.S. has a military operation going on. The UN is automatically sidelined by that, and that's not Ban Ki-moon's fault. The most perfect Secretary General in others' eyes, wouldn't be able to do any differently. He's elevated the position of women. He's done a lot on the reform. They've gotten the Human Rights Council up and running. So I think you got to look at it in the context of what's possible in the UN. And it's not a perfect system, but it's an indispensable, as in Obama's administration words yesterday, imperfect but indispensable. It's the most frustrating organization to work in. But on the other hand, it does work, but it's on a consensus basis and it's never perfect.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn, the UN Charter defines the position of Secretary General as Chief Administration Officer. Do you think that works?
Not really. I think the problem is that he's defined as Chief Administration Officer. In reality, is Secretary General to the Security Council and the General Assembly, and therefore the spokesperson for the whole organisation in all spheres, in all times, in all activities. And I think there is a serious structural problem in the United Nations, which I'm not sure we're addressing. The UN itself is a product of the post-Second World War situation, where you have the 5 permanent members with veto powers. The proposal to extend the Security Council is a good one, but I'm not sure that veto powers are really what we want. Surely we need something that has more democracy within it, more activity and more influence from the General Assembly, and rather less of this sort of instant decision-making on the basis of what the P5 want. And I think if we're to bring about a world based on the UN Charter, then there has to be some significant changes in the structural way that it operates.
Imran Khan, what kind of a person do you think needs to be at the helm to address the issues that we're facing in the Middle East right now and in Pakistan, which, as we said, has been very unstable over the past few years, and there are issues like Kashmir still underlying? What kind of a person is needed to solve this?
Well, if you want a leader does not listen to commands from anyone. A leader goes by a certain vision. And I assume that the whole idea of United Nations after the Second World War was to bring peace in this world. It seems to me that as long as the interest of the major powers who have veto, as long as that is not affected, UN does do good work. But the moment their interests come in, UN becomes helpless. So maybe, it needs to be reformed. It needs to be made more democratic. But whatever happens, the weak need to be protected. I'm afraid it doesn't happen. And then there are double standards in the UN. Some UN resolutions are implemented, but then when the interest of the superpower comes in, it's not implemented. And so I think it is discredited in that way. You suddenly feel, here am I sitting in Pakistan, and we are watching our country sinking every day. We are watching this madness called the war on terror destroying our country. But where do we go? I mean, our government, I specifically talk about the drone attacks because it's a violation of all humanitarian laws made by the UN. You cannot eliminate suspects, their children, their wives, everyone. This is what drone attacks do. Now, where does Pakistan go to? And unfortunately, unless you have a strong body which can protect the weak, weak people are helpless.
Nancy Soderberg, we heard Imran Khan say that the UN, United Nations, is not holding up its end of the bargain, especially when it comes to countries like Pakistan. What do you have to say to that?
Well, first of all, on the expansion of the UN Security Council, the Secretary General has nothing to do with that. That's up to the member states. And I think you have to differentiate between the problems in the UN that member states reject versus the implementation of the instructions that the UN Secretary General gets. You can not like the instructions that are given to Ban Ki-moon, but you can't blame Ban Ki-moon for them.
Imran Khan, should the UN have a hand or a responsibility in fixing Pakistan and getting it back on its feet?
Well, if we go back to why the UN was created, it was the mess made, the millions of people that died in the Second World War. The idea was that there should be a body which the world could turn to, who could maintain peace. Now, either they should stop, the UN should not have any political role at all. It should just do humanitarian work. And it has done great work. I mean, when we had earthquake or the floods here, the various UN agencies came and did great work. But I'm specifically talking about when there's turmoil, political, Pakistan, which is, which is right now we are probably the country which is worst affected by this war on terror. The country could sink. The country could implode the way it's going. So I just think that in our cases, and there are other cases too, you need a body. Maybe you need reforms in the UN, but you definitely need a body which can sort of act as a judge, maybe like a international court, somewhere you could go to get protection. The only reason you have courts is the weak need protection from the strong. That's why you make laws. I'm afraid the UN is not doing that, and quite rightly it's pointed out that the Secretary General is not a leader. He's an appointed official, and he's just doing certain things which he's supposed to do, but then he should not be called a leader. It's just an official.
That's right. I wanted to take our viewers back to how the Secretary General is appointed. Now, as you said, they're appointed by the UN General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. Now, a candidate is then subject to the veto of any 5 of the permanent members of the Security Councils. Secretaries General serve a 5-year term that can be renewed indefinitely, although no one has so far held the office for more than 2 terms, and only one has served for a single term. Let me take you through them. The first Secretary General was Trygve Halvdan Lie. He was from Norway. He served 2 terms in office from 1946 to 1952. After his resignation, Dag Hammarskjöld served from Sweden from April 1953 until his sudden death in a plane crash in September 1961. U Thant from the Myanmar was unanimously appointed by the General Assembly to fill the unexpired term of Dag Hammarskjöld, but he was in office from 1961 to 1971. Next, Kurt Waldheim from Austria served as Secretary General from 1972 to 1981. China vetoed his plans for a 3rd term. And then Javier Pérez de Cuellar from Peru took on the role. That was from 1982 to 1991. Boutros Boutros-Ghali from Egypt became the 6th Secretary General of the United Nations from 1992 to 1996. He was the only Secretary General to serve only 1 term and was vetoed by the U.S. from seeking a 2nd term in office. After which Kofi Annan from Ghana served as Secretary General, and that was from 1997 to 2006, and he was the first to emerge from the ranks of the United Nations staff. Well, I want to take this now to Jeremy Corbyn, and as we're running through those Secretary Generals, there was one, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who only served for 1 term, and the main reason for that is because he did not get the backing from the U.S. Is this a flaw in the way that the heads of the United Nations are chosen, or in the system of the United Nations, where if you incur the wrath of one of the member states, especially one of the stronger member states, your survival is likely to be tarnished?
Well, that is a problem, and I think Boutros-Ghali was trying very hard, was keen on reforming the UN, and was keen on trying to be more assertive, more interventionist possibly, in bringing about issues such as Middle East and other disputes. And he was then vetoed on his reappointment. And clearly, for any General Secretary, they're looking over their shoulder the whole time to make sure that they're not offending any one of the Big 5. Well, the Big 5 at times do need to be offended and do need to be criticised and do need to be stood up to. We have a system where it is almost impossible for a General Secretary to enforce any resolution which is not fully supported by all of the Big 5, and I think this is a problem. Now, if the Security Council is expanded as is envisaged, with including, for example, India, Brazil, Germany, Japan, and maybe 2 other countries, then are they all going to have veto powers? And that is either going to make the position of the General Secretary more complicated because they have got to keep in with a larger number of people, and possibly make the position even weaker. And I think we have to look to how people feel about the UN around the world. If you ask a Palestinian what they feel about the UN, they'll have 2 emotions, I suspect. One will be welcoming the work of the UN Relief and Works Agency. Very good. They've kept people alive and they've kept supplies moving for a very long time, despite great difficulties. But they would have the deepest anger about the UN for its failure to assert any of the UN resolutions that should have brought about the end of the occupation of Palestine. So, and I think you could repeat that in many situations around the world. The UN has got to be politically more powerful and politically more effective and more responsive to the General Assembly rather than to the permanent members of the Security Council.
Ambassador, if we're talking about, as Jeremy Corbyn said, saying that the UN Secretary General is unable to stand up against the Security Council members, should we, as Imran Khan said, or should the UN refashion itself as more of a humanitarian mission rather than a political entity?
Absolutely not. I was at the White House when the president decided to veto Boutros-Ghali's second term, and it was really based on the fact that he wasn't working closely with us on the reforms that we wanted to move forward, and did get sort of off track. The UN is set up, and I think it's the only way it would really work. It's not perfect, but it's the only way that's really going to work. We pay the bills. We give them the instructions. We're not just going to, no country is going to just give the UN body a carte blanche to do what it wants. It wants to have some control or it would fail.
Do you agree, Imran Khan? You've been rather skeptical of the UN's role and how it's been able to hold up its responsibility. Is the problem the member states or the complete structure of the United Nations?
Well, I agree that UN has done some great work. I never said that that UN has been absolutely useless. The only time UN becomes ineffective when one of the major superpowers or the vetoing powers, when their interests come into it. And you see, if UN has to be effective, it must be able to resolve the major conflicts on this earth. And the reason why the amount of money, amount of lives being destroyed by these conflicts, the repercussions, the Palestinian issue, this UN seems to be ineffective. That needs to be, this whole war on terror started off because of the Palestinian issue. Now, this is an issue which needs to be resolved, and it would save billions of dollars and probably millions of lives, because this whole war on terror stemmed from there. Secondly, in Pakistan, India, the subcontinent, we desperately need peace here. The greatest number of poor people live in the subcontinent. But this one Kashmir issue, but there's the 2 UN resolutions in 1949, but they could not be implemented. Now, if UN was a powerful body which could resolve these issues, imagine what good it could do to this world. That's all I'm saying, that UN has done great work in various areas, but at the moment, if you look at the main conflicts, whether it's in Chechnya, which is a source of extremism, it creates extremism in the world. Wherever there's a feeling that there are double standards or there's injustice, that's what creates militancy and extremism. And if UN could resolve this, the earth would be a much safer place.
I actually disagree that the war on terrorism has to do with the Palestinian issue. And in India-Pakistan conflict, it's not a P5 involved. It's between India and Pakistan, not the P5. So you've got to look at it a little bit more broadly.
No, but can I say about the war on terror? The war, all the 9/11 terrorists were Arabs, and where does that anger come from? I mean, that's where it stemmed from, and then you've seen that spread all over.
Dysfunctional. Well, that's a different issue, but the 9/11 attacks were planned while the U.S. government was doing everything it could to create a Palestinian state. It has much more to do with the dysfunctional Arab states than the Arab-Israeli conflict. But that's another discussion.
It is another discussion, but all I'm saying is that...
If I could get Jeremy Corbyn to jump in.
Yeah, the point that Imran makes about the Kashmir conflict is a very good one, and a very important one, because of the failure of successive UN General Secretary, Security Council, General Assembly, everybody, to bring about a resolution in Kashmir. It's led to massive armaments in India and Pakistan, nuclearization of both countries, and vast expenditure on arms that frankly should have been spent on development, social needs, education, and everything else. I mean, there is a cost to not resolving conflicts. Now, I don't personally blame each General Secretary for it, but surely there is a UN resolution on it. There is a responsibility to try and bring about a settlement. How active is the UN in seriously bringing about a settlement then?
I think that's one for another show. There's plenty more to discuss, it seems. I'm afraid we're running out of time. But I would really like to thank our guests, Ambassador Nancy Soderberg in Washington, D.C., and in London, Jeremy Corbyn, Member of Parliament, and in Islamabad, Imran Khan, leader of the Justice Party. And thank you all so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your suggestions and comments. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.